From the moment I moved into my quiet suburban neighborhood, I could tell something was off about the woman across the street. Her name was Linda, though everyone else called her Karen, behind closed doors, the kind of neighbor who collected petty grievances like they were trophies. My first real encounter with her came 2 weeks after moving in, and it wasn't in the form of a polite welcome. It was her car, an aging beige sedan, parked directly across my driveway, angled just enough so that backing out required the precision of a stunt driver. The first time, I thought it might be a mistake. People get distracted, life happens. But the second time, when I had to be somewhere important and found her car in the exact same spot, the suspicion began to crawl in. This wasn't accidental. The third time left no doubt. This was deliberate. Linda's house was directly opposite mine, positioned so her front door had a perfect line of sight to my driveway. Every time her car appeared there, it was as though she wanted to remind me she was watching. My driveway wasn't just a strip of concrete anymore, it had become a battleground. At first, I tried to take the high road. I adjusted my schedule, parked on the street when I could, and even knocked on her door a few times, only to be met with the sound of blinds snapping shut. She never spoke to me, not even a word, but somehow she managed to communicate a message. This is my street, and I make the rules. It wasn't just me. Other neighbors had their stories, missing trash cans, anonymous HOA complaints, and mysterious letters slipped under doors. But for some reason, she seemed to have a special focus on me. My friends joked it was because my driveway was too perfect, the kind of thing that drove people like her crazy. The weeks turned into months, and every blocked morning started to feel like an ambush. The HOA, naturally, was useless. They cited technicalities, rules about street parking, and told me to work it out neighbor to neighbor. The police didn't care either, claiming it was a civil matter, unless her car actually entered my property. But deep down, I knew this wasn't just about parking. It was about control. And every time her sedan idled across my driveway, I could feel that control tightening like a noose. One Saturday morning, as I was about to leave for a friend's barbecue, I walked out to find her car blocking my driveway yet again. But this time, she was sitting inside, sunglasses on, sipping coffee from a travel mug. She didn't even pretend to be busy or unaware. She just stared at me as I stopped short in my driveway, waiting for her to move. Eventually, she pulled away, slow enough to make her point, and that was the moment I decided something had to change. I started documenting everything every time her car appeared, the date, the time, even the weather. I took photos, videos, and kept a log like a private investigator. I didn't know exactly how I'd use it yet, but I knew I'd need it. Then one day, about a year into this exhausting Cold War, I noticed something unusual. A small, weathered notice was taped to her front door. It was from the bank, a foreclosure notice. Linda's fortress was crumbling, and for the first time since moving in, I felt a flicker of hope. What I didn't know then was that her downfall would give me the chance for the ultimate revenge, one that would change the street forever. And I was already plotting my move. Chapter 2 would begin here, with the foreclosure news spreading through the neighborhood and my first steps toward acquiring her house. News travels fast in a small neighborhood, and bad news travels even faster. By the time I had confirmed what I'd seen on Linda's door, half the block had already heard whispers about her financial trouble. Some said it was credit card debt. Others claimed she'd been in a nasty legal battle over a failed business. Whatever the truth was, one thing was certain. The house across from mine, the one that had been the staging ground for so many of her petty wars, was slipping from her grasp. It was strange watching her routine begin to crack. She had always been a creature of control, her days marked by the same patterns: morning coffee in the driveway, afternoon lawn inspection, evening surveillance from her front window. But now there were changes. She stopped washing her car. Her lawn grew patchy, the weeds creeping in like silent invaders. Even the blinds she once snapped shut with militant precision now hung uneven, one slat broken. I didn't feel pity, not after a year of her deliberate harassment. Instead, I felt a cold, quiet satisfaction, the kind you don't show on your face but feel in your bones. Still, I knew better than to get ahead of myself. People in trouble sometimes pull off miraculous comebacks, and I couldn't risk her regaining her footing. That's when the idea started to take root. At first, it was just a daydream, me holding the deed to her house, her face pale as she realized the street she thought she controlled now belonged, quite literally, to me. But the more I thought about it, the more it shifted from fantasy to plan. I began researching the foreclosure process. In our state, once the bank took possession, the property would go to auction. Anyone could bid, but cash buyers had an advantage. I didn't have that kind of money lying around, but I had equity, savings, and just enough credit to make it possible if I moved quickly. In the meantime, I kept watching her. Sometimes she still tried to block my driveway, though it felt less like a power move and more like a desperate attempt to hold onto the last shred of control she had left. I let it happen without confrontation. I wanted her to feel comfortable enough to keep underestimating me. Then, one morning, I saw a second notice taped to her door. This one was brighter, newer, and carried an unmistakable finality. The auction date was set. In just 6 weeks, Linda's reign over the street would end. The next few days, the neighborhood was buzzing. Some neighbors speculated about who might buy the place. A young family, a landlord, maybe even someone who would tear it down. Nobody guessed the truth. Nobody knew that I was quietly arranging financing, speaking with a real estate attorney, and clearing every obstacle in my path to owning that property. Of course, I kept my cards close. If Linda caught wind of my interest, she might find a way to block me, even in her final days. She was resourceful when it came to pettiness, and I wasn't about to give her a chance to interfere. The day of the auction crept closer, and with it came subtle changes in her behavior. She stopped parking across my driveway entirely, almost as if she sensed her time was up. The street seemed quieter, calmer, but the silence wasn't peace. It was the calm before the storm. I knew I'd have only one chance to get this right. At the auction, competition would be fierce. Investors loved distressed suburban homes, and cash, heavy bidders often snapped them up without hesitation. I'd have to be bold, prepared to push my limit and maybe even step past it. As the last week before the auction began, I stood in my driveway one evening, looking at her darkened windows. It struck me how many hours of my life had been wasted because of that house, because of her. Every blocked morning, every petty act, every ounce of stress she'd caused was tied to that place. And now I had the power to turn it all around. I didn't want to just win. I wanted to make a statement, the kind of victory that would echo through the neighborhood for years. The day of reckoning was coming. Chapter 3 would open with the auction day itself, the tense bidding war, and the moment the gavel came down in my favor. The morning of the auction felt different from any other day in the neighborhood. The air was heavy, the sky overcast, as if the weather itself had decided to witness what was about to happen. I woke up before dawn, unable to sleep, and spent the early hours pacing through my house, rehearsing the numbers in my head. I knew my budget down to the last dollar, but part of me feared that in the heat of the moment, adrenaline might override reason. The auction wasn't happening at Linda's house. The county held all foreclosure sales at a downtown government building. The room they used wasn't glamorous. No velvet chairs or gavel, wielding auctioneer straight out of a movie. Just rows of folding chairs, a long table at the front, and a dozen or so people clutching paperwork and envelopes of certified funds. When I arrived, I scanned the crowd, looking for potential competition. There were the usual players, investors in crisp suits, a couple of flippers in hoodies and baseball caps, and one or two curious onlookers who were probably just there to watch the drama. I didn't recognize any neighbors, which was good. The fewer people who knew my plan, the better. The auctioneer called the first property, rattling off the legal description and starting bid. I listened with half an ear, waiting for the moment my target came up. Each sale was over in minutes, the rhythm quick and ruthless. Open, bid, outbid, sold. The room smelled faintly of coffee and tension. Then it happened. The auctioneer read the address I knew by heart. Linda's house. My pulse quickened. The opening bid was set low, a number that sounded deceptively affordable but would climb fast. I raised my hand immediately, not to win with the first bid, but to signal I was in the game. An investor to my left countered. I went up again. A woman in the back jumped in. Within seconds, the price was climbing, each number called like a drumbeat in my chest. I kept my voice steady, my bids quick, showing no hesitation. That was key. If they thought I was timid, they'd push harder. The crowd began to thin. The woman in the back dropped out. One of the suited investors hesitated just long enough for me to push past him. Now it was just me and the man to my left, a flipper, judging by the way he scanned the paperwork and kept glancing at me. He didn't want the house, he wanted the deal. The numbers climbed higher than I'd planned, each new bid scraping against the limits of my budget. But I couldn't stop now. This wasn't just about a property. It was about every blocked driveway, every petty slight, every silent stare from behind those crooked blinds. Finally, the investor hesitated. The auctioneer called my bid once, twice, and then slammed his hand down on the table. Sold. Just like that, it was mine. A strange stillness settled over me. After all the months of frustration, the endless documentation, the quiet planning, I had just bought Linda's house. The very place she had used as a tool of control over me was now under my name. I completed the paperwork in a daze, handed over the cashier's check, and walked out into the crisp morning air. The sun had broken through the clouds, casting a pale light over the city streets. It felt symbolic, though I tried not to read too much into it. On the drive home, I passed her house slowly. She was outside, standing on the lawn, hands on her hips, speaking to someone I didn't recognize. She didn't know yet. That was the part I savored most. She had no idea that the man across the street now held the keys to her life. But I wasn't going to tell her not yet. I wanted the reveal to be perfect. For now, I let her go about her day, blissfully unaware that her reign over the street was already over. Chapter 4 will open with the day I finally tell Linda that I own her house, and her explosive reaction. The days following the auction felt surreal. I had the winning bid, the paperwork, and soon the deed would be in my name. The bank's process moved slowly, but my ownership was already official in every way that mattered. And yet, across the street, Linda carried on as if nothing had changed. She still emerged every morning with her coffee, scanning the street like a self-appointed security guard. She still peered through those uneven blinds in the evenings, as though she could keep control by sheer observation. But now there was something different in her posture, a nervousness I hadn't seen before. Perhaps she could feel the ground shifting beneath her feet, though she didn't know how far it had already collapsed. I waited for the right moment to tell her, not because I needed to gloat, though the temptation was there, but because I wanted it to be undeniable, unmissable. I wanted her to hear it in a way that left no room for her usual games, no space for denial or manipulation. That moment came 2 weeks later. The bank had sent me the final transfer documents, and I had in my hand a certified copy of the deed with my name on it. The keys would come soon, but this piece of paper was all I needed. That Saturday morning, I walked out onto my driveway, documents in hand, just as she stepped out onto her porch. She was mid-sip from her coffee mug when she noticed me. I stood there for a moment, letting her curiosity work against her, before crossing the street. Her expression shifted as I approached, at first wary, then defensive. I could almost hear the unspoken "what now?" in her eyes. When I reached her front walk, I didn't bother with preamble. I simply held out the deed, unfolded so the address and my name were clearly visible. Her reaction was instantaneous and exactly what I had imagined. Her eyes darted to the paper, then back to me, then to the paper again, as though she was trying to spot a trick. Her face flushed, then drained of color. For a moment she didn't speak. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again, but no words came. She glanced toward her driveway, toward her car, the same car that had been my prison gate for over a year, and then back to me. Finally, she took a small step back, as if the paper itself carried some kind of force. I didn't need to say much. I just told her, in the calmest tone I could manage, that the property now belonged to me and that, soon enough, the locks would be changed. The silence that followed was heavy, almost oppressive. The neighborhood itself seemed to pause, as if every house and tree was leaning in to witness the moment. Then it came, not in words, but in a burst of sound. She slammed her coffee mug down on the porch rail so hard that coffee splashed across the wood. She muttered something I couldn't catch and retreated inside, the door closing with a sharp, final click. I didn't follow. I didn't need to. The message had been delivered, and it had landed with all the weight I'd intended. That night, I saw her blinds twitch more than usual. Lights flickered on and off. It was the restless behavior of someone whose world had been tipped upside down, and who had no idea how to set it right. Within days, a moving truck appeared. She was gone before the week was out. No goodbyes, no parting shots. Just a quiet disappearance, leaving behind an empty house that was now mine to do with as I pleased. Standing in the doorway for the first time as its owner, I felt the strange satisfaction of victory. But also something else, the awareness that the story wasn't over, because now I had 2 houses, and with them more power on this street than Linda had ever dreamed of. The day I stepped into Linda's former house as its new owner, I wasn't just crossing a threshold, I was claiming territory. The air inside was stale, heavy with the scent of dust and neglect, as if the walls themselves were exhaling after years under her rule. The blinds were still crooked, the same ones she had used to spy on me. The kitchen counter still bore faint coffee stains. It was as though time had stopped here the moment she left. I walked slowly from room to room, taking it all in. The house was in decent shape, though not without its scars, scuffed walls, a few broken tiles, the faint outline of furniture that had been dragged away in a hurry. But none of that mattered. What mattered was what it represented: the end of a year, long battle, and the beginning of something entirely new. For days I considered my options. I could rent it out. I could flip it for a profit. I could even keep it as a guest house. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the true victory wasn't just in owning it. It was in shaping what it became. This house had been a source of tension and resentment, and I wanted to turn it into the exact opposite. So I started renovations almost immediately: fresh paint, new floors, modern fixtures, the kind of changes that breathed life into the place and erased every trace of its former owner. Contractors came and went, their trucks parked right in the driveway Linda had once guarded like a fortress. Every hammer strike felt like a symbolic dismantling of her legacy. The neighborhood noticed. People who had once avoided walking past her house now slowed down to admire the progress. They asked questions, offered suggestions, even brought over coffee and snacks for the crew. For the first time since moving here, I felt a genuine sense of community. But it wasn't just about making the house look good. I wanted it to serve a purpose. That's when I decided I wouldn't rent it out to just anyone. I'd be selective. The new residents would be people who valued harmony, who would contribute to the neighborhood instead of poisoning it. After a month of work, the transformation was complete. The beige, tired facade had been replaced with a clean, welcoming exterior. The overgrown lawn was trimmed and landscaped. The interior was bright, open, and modern. It was no longer Linda's house. It was a home with a future. I listed it quietly, without a public open house, relying instead on word of mouth and trusted contacts. Within weeks, I found the perfect tenants, a young couple expecting their first child. They loved the neighborhood, respected the space, and were grateful for the opportunity to move in. When they arrived, the street felt different. Neighbors came out to greet them. There were smiles, laughter, and a noticeable absence of tension. Even the air seemed lighter, as though a storm had passed. And here's the thing: my driveway, it stayed clear. Always, no games, no petty acts, no silent standoffs. The constant irritation that had once overshadowed my daily life was gone. But beyond that, I now had influence. Owning 2 properties on the same street meant that my voice carried weight with the HOA and with the community. Decisions that had once been dictated by people like Linda now required my input. The balance of power had shifted, and it was no longer tilted in favor of the petty or the vindictive. For the first time, I understood that this was more than revenge. This was about control, not the destructive kind Linda had practiced, but the kind that builds, protects, and improves. And as satisfying as it was to know I'd turned the tables, I couldn't shake the feeling that my story with this house wasn't quite finished. Because every now and then, I caught myself wondering what would happen if Linda came back. Chapter 6 will open with an unexpected twist, a sighting of Linda, and the tension it stirs up in the newly peaceful neighborhood. It had been months since Linda's abrupt departure, and in that time the street had settled into a rare and welcome rhythm. The young couple in her former house had fit in perfectly, their laughter drifting from the porch in the evenings, their driveway always neatly kept. The neighborhood gatherings, once tense affairs, now felt relaxed and genuine. It was as though the absence of one person had unclenched the entire block. Then, one gray November afternoon, I saw her. It was subtle at first, just a flash of that familiar beige sedan turning slowly onto the street. I froze at my window, coffee halfway to my lips, as the car rolled past my driveway. The same make, the same faded paint, even the same dent in the rear bumper. She drove slowly, scanning the houses, her eyes hidden behind those oversized sunglasses she always wore. When she reached her old place, she didn't stop, but her head turned, lingering on the new flowers planted along the walkway, the fresh paint, the sight of strangers living in what was once her domain, and then, for just a moment, her gaze shifted, across the street, to me. It was only a second, but it was long enough for a jolt of unease to settle in my chest. I couldn't tell if she recognized me, if she even knew I was watching, but something in that glance carried the weight of unfinished business. She didn't stop the car, she didn't speak to anyone, she just drove on, disappearing at the far end of the street. I told myself it was nothing, curiosity, maybe even nostalgia. People sometimes check in on old homes. But as the days passed, I saw her again, always at odd times, always slow driving, never stopping, sometimes once a week, sometimes twice. Never enough to cause a scene, but enough to notice. I didn't mention it to the new tenants. They were happy, and I didn't want to plant seeds of worry. Instead, I documented it, the way I once did with her driveway blockades, date, time, direction of travel. It felt absurd, almost paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was circling, testing boundaries. Then came the afternoon when she parked. It was a weekday, quiet, the street nearly empty. I stepped outside to collect my mail and saw her sedan at the curb in front of her old house. She was out of the car, standing on the sidewalk, just staring at it. Her hands were in her coat pockets, her posture rigid. I called out, not confrontational, just a neutral greeting. She didn't respond. She didn't even look at me. After a few moments, she returned to her car and drove away without a word. But that night, for the first time in months, I noticed the blinds in my own house twitching, my own reflexive surveillance, born of old habits. The street felt different again. The peace I had built was strong, but not unshakable, and I knew, deep down, that Linda was not the type to let go of something she believed was hers. Chapter 7 will pick up with her attempts to insert herself back into the neighborhood, and my growing determination to make sure history doesn't repeat itself. The sightings became more frequent after that day. At first, Linda's visits were cautious, almost hesitant, a slow drive down the street, a glance at her old property, and then she would vanish. But over time, her presence grew bolder. She began parking her car along the curb for longer stretches, sometimes stepping out to walk the sidewalk under the guise of getting exercise. The neighbors noticed. You could see it in the way their conversations paused when her sedan appeared, in the uneasy glances traded across lawns. The young couple in her former home mentioned, in passing, that they'd seen a woman loitering nearby, but they didn't yet know the history. I decided not to tell them not yet. Her tactics were different this time. She didn't shout, she didn't file petty complaints, and she didn't park across anyone's driveway. Instead, she played the part of the curious visitor, lingering just long enough to make her presence known, but not long enough to invite confrontation. It was a quieter kind of control, a psychological game. Then she started talking to people. I caught sight of her leaning on her car, chatting with a couple of residents down the street who hadn't lived here during her reign. She smiled, laughed, gestured toward her old house as if reminiscing. I couldn't hear what she was saying, but I could guess. She was planting seeds, small, harmless, sounding comments that would eventually sprout into something more. It wasn't long before subtle shifts began to appear. The new tenants in her old house mentioned that someone had told them the previous owner might want to buy it back someday. Another neighbor asked me, in an oddly casual tone, if I'd ever consider selling one of my properties. It was obvious where these ideas were coming from. I didn't bite. I stayed polite, but firm, each time the topic surfaced. And I made sure the young couple knew they were secure. Their lease was ironclad. Their home was theirs to enjoy without interference. But I also started preparing for the possibility that Linda wasn't just circling, she was plotting. I reviewed my property records, reinforced the security systems on both houses, and even installed cameras covering the street. If she wanted to play games, I would make sure the rules were mine, not hers. Then came the moment I knew she was escalating. One chilly evening, just after sunset, I stepped out to take my trash to the curb. As I reached the driveway, I saw her car parked 2 houses down. She was sitting in the driver's seat, headlights off, just watching. The sight stopped me cold. It was too familiar, too much like the early days when she used to blockade my driveway for sport. I didn't approach. I simply met her gaze across the distance, letting the silence between us do the talking. After a long pause, she started the engine and drove away, but I knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Chapter 8 will close the story with the final confrontation that makes sure Linda can never reclaim her foothold on the street. By the time winter had settled over the neighborhood, Linda's appearances had gone from occasional to routine. She was no longer pretending to be a passerby. She was making herself part of the scenery, as though sheer presence could carve her name back into this street. Her visits always carried the same undertone, a quiet challenge. She never said anything to me directly, but her eyes, her timing, the way she positioned her car, it all spoke the same language she'd used years before when she blocked my driveway. It was the language of ownership, of territory. I had learned enough from the past to know that letting this fester would invite escalation. So I decided that if she wanted to play one last game, it would end on my terms. The first step was documentation. I gathered footage from my new security cameras, the slow drive, bys, the parked car, the lingering at the curb. I added notes, dates, times. I spoke with the young couple, explaining the situation in plain terms for the first time. They weren't just shocked, they were angry. This was their home now, and they weren't about to have someone haunt it like a ghost from the past. The second step was legal. I contacted my attorney, who wasted no time drafting a trespass warning. It was precise, enforceable, and, if ignored, would allow for immediate police action. The paperwork alone was enough to cut through the vague, non-confrontational games Linda had been playing. The final step was the delivery. It happened on a crisp Saturday morning. She had parked directly in front of her old house again, leaning against her car as if she belonged there. I crossed the street slowly, the folded document in my hand. She watched me approach, her sunglasses hiding her eyes, but I could feel the tension in her posture. I stopped a few feet away, held out the papers, and told her clearly, calmly, that this was her formal notice to stay off my property and to cease any contact with my tenants. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten. I simply stated the fact. She no longer had any claim here, and if she ignored the notice, the police would be involved. For a moment, she didn't move. Then she took the papers, glanced at them, and let out a short, bitter laugh. It wasn't amusement, it was disbelief. But there was no comeback this time, no smug retort. She got into her car, shut the door, and drove away. And this time, she didn't come back. Weeks passed without a sighting. The street returned to its easy rhythm. The young couple decorated for spring. Neighbors chatted at the mailbox, and the air felt light again. The cameras stayed up, the documents stayed on file, but the sense of being watched was gone. Standing on my driveway one evening, looking across at the house that had once been a symbol of daily frustration, I felt the weight of the story finally lift. This wasn't just revenge anymore, it was closure. I had bought the house to end a petty feud, but in doing so, I had reshaped the neighborhood. And Linda, She was just a name in the past now, a story people told newcomers with a shake of the head and a laugh. The street was mine again. The last move had been made.